Hello, folks. Glad you've joined us. We're going to be starting here. I want to thank you very much for being interested in this webinar on franchising your business. You're going to learn a lot of the pros and cons, what is required legally, and also some alternatives to franchising. We have two excellent attorneys today with us from the firm McNees Wallace and Nurick who will be helping present this morning. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsors, if I could. They are Capital Blue Cross and also Members First Federal Credit Union. Our presenters today are Brian Gregg, he's chairman of the Food and Beverage Practice Group, and also Mike Doctorow, chair of the Intellectual Property Group at McNees. Gentlemen, I'm really excited to hear from you, and I let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Today we're going to cover at a high level the issue of franchising. We're going to talk about the what is a franchise, the how you go about it from a legal perspective, and the why you would want a franchise, why your franchisees would want to buy your franchise opportunity. So let's talk a little bit about the what. A franchise can have, it's not always clear what a franchise looks like. There's sort of several different business platforms that might seem like a franchise, but it matters if you fall into the category of franchising because it's heavily regulated. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the three basic elements of a franchise: it's going to be a business system, it's going to involve a common trademark, and a fee. And if all three of those things are present, you're a franchise, whether you intended it or not. Let's look at some of the other things that you might think about that sometimes seem like franchises but really aren't. So if you take away the system and you just have a mark and a fee, you might have a license, a trademark license. Some people try to avoid franchising by granting a trademark license. And we'll talk about that specific distinction in a few minutes. The real key there is whether there's a system, whether there's control and assistance provided by the franchisor. We'll talk about that in a moment. Another might be a business opportunity where there is a fee charge for use of a business system, but there's no trademark involved. So maybe someone helps you set up a business, provides you with a system of doing business, and you pay them for it, but then you go off on your own, you use your own trademark. So that's really just buying a shortcut to doing to operating a business, and it's not a franchise. Then there's some other business models that look a little like franchising but are not, where maybe you're buying some inventory and you're selling a product under a trademark. You might use a certain means of conducting those sales, but you're not paying for access to that system. You're really just buying inventory and selling it. Again, that's probably not a franchise. You really need to have the trademark, the fee, and the system in place. Let's talk about the distinction between licensing and franchising. This is where most people try to distinguish the two business models. Now, both of them involve a trademark or trade name. Both of them involve paying a fee or paying a royalty based on sales. But the main difference is the amount and the type of involvement of the licensor or the franchisor. And when we talk about licensing, that involvement, that control is really centered on the use of the trademark. Whether it's displayed properly, there might be some quality control over the product or service itself, but there's not much control over the operation of the business. And when you start seeing control over the operation of the business, we'll go through some examples in a moment, that starts to sound like a franchise and probably takes you away from licensing into franchising. So when we look at that control or assistance that signifies or signals a franchise business being offered, many of those things are things like the overall design of the site and the appearance of the business, hours the business might operate, the way it goes through producing the product and keeping the books, dealing with personnel, the location, and a cohesive advertising approach. Those are the kinds of control that often trigger a franchise. Franchisors often assist their franchisees as well. They want their franchises to be successful, so they may require certain repairs to a business. They may require certain updating to the business to keep it fresh, to keep it consistent with the franchisor's brand guidelines. They'll require ongoing training. They'll provide that training and assistance. They'll provide guidance for management, how to manage the business, and they usually help the franchisee select the location. They'll probably have a right to approve that, and they'll provide a detailed operations manual. So that's the kind of assistance that if you see that in the context of a trademark, it's probably a franchise. Let's talk a little bit about how franchising actually works. Here, the franchisee is usually going to pay some sort of initial fee for the right to enter into the system. It's called an initial franchise fee, and the amount varies depending on the franchise opportunity. But it might be anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 for someone to buy into the franchise system. And because of that significant upfront investment, there are some disclosure rules that we'll talk about in a few minutes. There's other fees that franchisees typically have to pay a franchisor. Usually, there's an ongoing royalty. So the franchisor is going to want to look at the sales of the franchisee and assess a royalty based on those sales. And those royalty amounts can vary, but you might see anything from 4 to 10%. Some of the things franchisees don't typically expect until they get into a franchise relationship is contributing to the overall advertising fund for the franchisor. So usually, a franchisor is going to impose some requirement that the franchisee pay into a common fund so that the franchisor can conduct system-wide advertising, consistent commercials, consistent advertising, and consistent promotion across that franchise business. Other fees or requirements that the franchisor may impose on a franchisee is the requirement that they buy products from the franchisor or from approved sales channels. So the franchisee may think that they can get into the franchise business and use their own channels to buy products or to buy ingredients and find out that the franchisor has specific requirements. Sometimes the franchisor even makes a profit on the products it sells to the franchisee. Now, in exchange for those fees, the franchisor supports the franchisee. So the franchisor provides some initial training. It provides an operations manual and the systems that the franchisee needs to conduct a successful business. And the franchisor is going to want that franchisee to be successful. So he's going to provide ongoing supervision and ongoing support of the franchisee. Franchisor will often assist the franchisee in other aspects of the business. So for example, if there are issues with the landlord for a franchise business, the franchisor might step in and help the franchisee out. The franchisor is always going to have that vested interest in wanting the franchisee to be successful, in wanting the franchisee's business to look and fit in with the overall franchise. So that means that if there's an issue with the building, an issue with the location, that's a situation where the franchisor might step in and help the franchisee.
May I ask a quick question, if I could, Brian? I just wondered, some of the folks who are listening probably are, just considering being a franchisor, so they're thinking then that maybe the low end of what they would charge initially to succeed might be in the $10,000 range, but then it's the McDonald's and the Subways that are up at the $50,000. Would that be an example?
Yeah, I think when you look at a franchisor that's just starting out, usually they're trying to attract franchisees. So they're going to make their system more attractive to a prospective franchisee by offering more affordable initial franchise fees, by being more flexible in terms of location, and by providing a lot more assistance. It's really important that those initial franchise businesses succeed and do well. And so in my experience, when you have a young franchise, the franchisor is usually really exerting tremendous effort to make sure that the franchisees are successful, but also being fairly flexible on the fees that are being charged. And you will see over time, as the franchise gains traction and starts to be more popular and people are beating down the door to buy franchise opportunities, now the fees start going up. The franchisor can be more selective about who he or she wants to sell franchise businesses to, and for that reason might not need to provide quite as much hand-holding to the franchisees as they get up and running.
And one very short.
Fees,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. On the other hand, the initial franchise fees have to be great enough for the franchisor to cover their initial expenditures in developing the franchise system. Obviously, the franchisor doesn't want to go through this effort without making money. So the fee has to be set at a high enough level that at least their expenses are being covered, plus some profit margin.
And the one last short question, so does the person who buys the franchise have to open their books in the agreement then, so you can keep track of what they are making?
Yeah, so if you mean, let's use the restaurant example. You know, many restaurant businesses are franchises. So the franchisee, or let's put it this way, the franchisor is going to have a direct window on the franchisee's books. Usually they're going to use an integrated system that's deployed to all the franchise businesses, through which the franchisor is able to have visibility on sales and inventory and really all aspects of the business, so that there is some understanding of what's going on at the franchisee level.
Okay, sorry to delay you. Go right ahead. I'll try not to interrupt again.
Okay.
Those are very good questions.
Appreciate the questions. Feel free to jump in if you have more. So if you decide that a franchise business is the right thing for you, you should understand that it's a heavily regulated industry at both the state and federal level. The heart of the agreement between the franchisor and the franchisee is the franchise agreement, but there's another document that's required under federal and state law, and that's a franchise disclosure document, or an FDD. If you're looking at older forms, you might see it called a UFOC, but the current term under federal law is the franchise disclosure document. And the franchise agreement is a fairly long, fairly complex legal agreement that's full of legalese, and so the federal and state laws require that essentially a plain English explanation of the franchise agreement be provided to any prospective franchisee. So that's your disclosure document. It discloses the terms of the franchise opportunity in fairly plain English. So any franchisor that's looking to sell franchises has to develop a number of documents. You have your franchise agreement, you have your disclosure document that mirrors that franchise agreement but explains it in plain English. You'll have an operations manual and maybe some other agreements that go along with the business. So there's a fair amount of preparation needed to prepare these documents in order to just begin selling franchise businesses. Now, in addition to developing the documents, in many states you have to have them pre-approved before you start selling franchise businesses. There's about a dozen states, there's a map, that require pre-registration and approval of your franchise disclosure document. And while all states don't require this, enough do that usually anybody who's offering a franchise business is going to have to go through one of them at some point.
And if you notice, Pennsylvania is not a registration state,
right?
But for franchises that are being developed in Pennsylvania, we have to be concerned because New York, Maryland, Virginia, and even the close states of Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois are registration states. So registration will be an issue right up front for most franchises in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. And in addition to the states that require a formal approval of your franchise disclosure document, many others, you'll see them in green here, require some other kind of filing. So for example, Texas and Florida require a one-time notice filing. You don't have to give them your franchise disclosure document. They don't have to approve it, but you do still need to make a filing in those states to alert them that you're selling franchise businesses in those states. And of course, there's a fee. So the bottom line is, before you jump into any state, you need to have an understanding of what their disclosure or registration requirements are. And this is a fairly big headache for franchisors. The law is supposed to be fairly uniform among states, but the reality is that it's not. When you file the same franchise disclosure document in Maryland that you've had approved in California, you will undoubtedly get a couple pages of comments the first time around from the Maryland franchise examiner, who wants to pound your franchise disclosure document into the form that they want to see. So each time you go into a new state, you have to make a filing. This process in a registration state, the blue ones that you see here, it can often take 4 to 6 months by the time you get your document on file. You go back and forth with the examiner a few times, getting them to accept your document. You make changes to it. So you have to do some planning ahead if you want to be selling franchises in these states. And it's quite a challenge to try to keep the disclosure document a single document when you have a dozen or so states trying to influence it. In many cases, you can make state-specific changes in an addendum to your franchise disclosure document. But even in that situation, I've seen some state examiners require that the change be made right in the body of the document. So this is a big hurdle for anybody getting into the, anybody that wants to sell a franchise business, is getting registered in the states that you need to be registered in and trying to keep your document, as cohesive as possible. It also can cause delays in selling franchise opportunities, because you may have someone come from California that wants to buy a franchise business, and if you're not registered in California, you may not be able to sell them a franchise for 4 to 6 months. So the registration issue is one that often catches franchisors by surprise, and something they need to be aware of going in.
In addition to the initial filing, there are annual updates that are required to be made. And if there is a significant or substantive change to the franchise agreement, the FDD must be updated in each of the states, each time requiring the involvement of an attorney, and each time requiring the payment of another fee.
Yeah, so there's ongoing responsibility to keep your document up to date in all of those registration states. So when you're thinking of launching a franchise, one of the things you need to build into your budget is the development of these documents and getting them approved. And that can be a fairly significant lift, at least at the beginning. We talked about this disclosure document, the FDD. Some of the things that disclosure document requires you to disclose are a description of the business. You'll have to provide some background information on the key owners and key personnel of the business. Many franchisors choose to include financial performance information. So if their business has done well, they're going to disclose that information so that the franchisee sees that this is a profitable business opportunity. And there are specific ways that you have to go about disclosing financial information about your business. Of course, as you might imagine, the state and federal laws are all about trying to protect the consumer from deceptive information. Another big part of the disclosure document is trying to make clear to the prospective franchisee what their initial investment's going to be. So there is that initial franchise fee, and there's the ongoing royalties and advertising fees, but many franchisors are going to require that a franchisee buy a certain initial amount of inventory and spend a certain amount on local advertising. Most franchisors will require a grand opening where you may have to have additional advertising and promotion. So there's a whole list of fees, usually explained in a table, that help a franchisee understand what's my initial investment going to be? What am I going to have to come up with to get this franchise up and running? Disclosure document is also going to, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, it's pretty discouraging hearing about all the regulatory requirements. There are some really good points people will be looking forward to. You can really do well, or give us the other side of the picture too in short order.
Yeah, so I was going to cover some of the major points of the franchise agreement, and then we are going to talk, Mike in particular is going to talk about why franchising can be an incredibly profitable business model.
Okay, we'll stay on the line.
There are these legal hurdles to it, and to some people, franchising is sort of a four-letter word. But if you just look around, there are many incredibly successful franchises that do well, and the ones that do well tend to have understood these issues and found a way to navigate them, and they're often selling franchises in a successful way. So some of the major deal points that you're going to want to think about when you approach a prospective franchisee are, what are those initial fees? How are you going to make money? What sort of royalties are you going to charge? I mean, the initial fees are typically going to cover your, as the franchisor's, costs in getting this business up and running for a franchisee. You might make a little profit on the initial fees, but really you're going to be looking at what are those ongoing royalties. So you might need to do some some business research on what those royalties should be. And you can get other people's franchise documents. You can take a look at your industry and see what makes sense for you. Territory is a big one. A franchisee is going to expect some kind of exclusivity in a territory, and so you'll have to work out the terms of what that looks like. You'll have to discuss the initial investment. What do you expect the franchisee to pay into your system in addition to the initial fee, but what other inventory and things do they have to buy? Term and termination is a big one. A franchisee is typically going to want enough security that they're going to be covered under this franchise agreement for a period of time long enough for them to recoup that initial investment. So you tend not to see franchise agreements for 1 or 2 years. You tend to see them for 5 or 10 years with fairly flexible options for renewing the franchise. And then much of the franchise agreement is going to be talking about the selection of the location. How much control does the franchisor have? Where does it have to be? Because a key to any successful business, particularly a franchise business such as a restaurant, is going to be location. So the franchisor is going to be keenly interested in making sure that the franchisee has a great location selected. Some of the other things that you might see covered in a franchise agreement are going to be whether there are certain approved suppliers for supplies that the franchisee has to purchase through. Many franchise agreements include options for multiple units. So here is an opportunity for the franchisor to sell more than one franchise at a time. That's a whole additional agreement that you might want to include so that your franchisee can buy into the system in a bigger way. You may have special options like mobile kiosks or opportunities to sell products at special venues. And the franchisor might want to include terms that control how much and how the franchisee can advertise its business on social media or otherwise. Usually the franchisor wants fairly significant control over that. So those are some of the key terms that you see reflected in a franchise agreement and then also discussed in plain English in the disclosure documents.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the practical aspects of franchising. When does a business consider franchising? So this slide outlines what is really necessary for someone to consider franchising his business. Do you have a replicable system? Can the same system be readily duplicated by the franchisee? Will it work in every location? Will it work with any manager? Will the trademark work be available throughout the United States or even worldwide? The franchisor should have several successful locations to ensure the system works and so that he's able, from a practical standpoint, to convince others that the system will work. By a replicable system, we look at something like McDonald's, for example. When people are driving down the road, they see the golden arches, they know everything about the cleanliness of the store, the layout of the store, the food that's available, etc. That's the type of replicable system that you need in order for a franchise to be successful. Can it be documented? Can you or have you written down every aspect of the system that makes it successful? For example, the store layout or location, the number and type of employees, what the recipes or formulas are, what the signage should look like, etc. Can the system be sold? If you have a very good business, but it's not something that people want to do, it's going to be very difficult to be a successful franchise. So are people asking to buy into your system? If people aren't asking, you might not be able to sell it. Another issue is... So
could you highlight a little bit, could you just elaborate? For example, you mean if it doesn't sound like fun or it would be very difficult, or can you give me an idea of what you mean?
Sure, that's exactly right. For example, we've seen lately an awful lot of frozen yogurt franchises pop up. Everyone wants to sell frozen yogurt. It's very it's a nice, fun business. There are always lines out in front of the stores. And so that's a business which has been very easy to sell. Whether it's profitable or not, people see lines out in front and think, this is something that I want to do. Take, for example, a cleaning franchise. Let's say an office cleaning franchise, for example. They can be very, very profitable. However, they require a lot of work. Sometimes they require work at night. Sometimes you have to deal with people who are actually going to be cleaning the buildings. And people don't see lines out in front of the office cleaning business, so people aren't lined up to buy into that franchise. So you have to find a way with a business like that to attract people, to make them understand how profitable it is, to make them understand how well it works. It's a lot harder sale. The next issue is your brand protectable or is it protected? So do you have a trademark that can be used throughout the entire United States? Have you screened it through a trademark attorney to make sure that that's possible? Or has it already been registered so that it's available for use throughout the United States or in the countries in which you want to franchise? And then finally, do you have people available with the expertise or the desire to run a franchised business, that is the business of selling franchises, as opposed to just having people available that like to run a donut shop or an ice cream store, etc. It's a very, very different type of business model, and you have to ensure that you have the expertise and the desire on hand from your workforce to make the franchise successful. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the benefits from a franchisor's perspective are many. So we have on here reduced long-term cost of expansion. This actually is, despite what Brian had to say, a lower cost method to expand. The franchisees buy or rent the location, they buy or rent the equipment, they buy or rent the inventory. The franchisees hire the staff, the franchisees pay the attorneys and the accountants, the franchisees pay the taxes, the franchisees advertise on their own, and they pay into an advertising fund. So it is the franchisees in this instance that finance the expansion of the franchise business, as opposed to the franchisors doing it on their own with their own capital. So again, it's a very, very low-cost way of expanding very, very rapidly. The reason that it can help with rapid expansion is you don't have to go out and finance the system. You don't need to find locations. You don't need to find managers. You actually have franchisees who are interested in working for the business and making it successful. You don't need to find employees. And you don't need the dollars to develop each location. Finally, you have this dedicated independent managers and operators. If somebody is investing as a franchisee, they presumably will have a profit motive and an incentive to make the franchise work, unlike the situation where you merely hire salaried managers to operate your own stores. So let's go back and talk about the advantages from the franchisee's perspective, because there are many there as well. The franchisee doesn't need to start from square one. They know, based on the lines that are out front of the store, whether the system works and whether it can be successful. There is a much, much higher success rate for franchisees than for other businesses that are started from scratch. The franchisees also know that the brand is protectable, that it's going to be well known nationwide if the franchise is successful, and that it's protected maybe through a trademark filing. You also know that as a franchisee that you're going to get help from the franchisor to be successful. they're going to transfer their knowledge to you as a franchisee on exactly what works. The size of the store, the number of employees that you need, the time the store must be open, recipes, advertising, systems of operation. The franchisee knows that it's going to get help in being successful through basically all avenues of the business. And then lastly, you have, the combined buying power of the franchise system as opposed to just one franchisee trying to go out and buy product. Just by way of example, we have a franchise who uses Coca-Cola. They get significant discounts for volume purchasing of Coke. Those would not be available to one single store that was opened by a franchisee. So you have this combined buying power for your advertising, for your inventory, for your equipment, all of which is very, very important to the franchisee's success. So not to be a naysayer here, but there are obviously disadvantages from a practical standpoint as well from the franchisor's perspective. So there are advantages to having independent operators out there as franchisees, and there are some disadvantages. These franchisee investors expect and want support and success, and they can blame the franchisor if they don't succeed or if they feel that they were misled. So the offering circulars, the franchise disclosure document, FDD, must accurately and reasonably disclose all risks associated with the franchise and explain the benefits of being involved in the franchise system in a fair and balanced manner. Other things that the independent operators might do is, for example, they might try to learn the system and leave and compete with you, whereas a manager wouldn't have the capacity to do that. You don't have complete control over independent franchisees. So they are independent, they're independent business people. The franchisor can impose standards on them, quality standards and systems of operation, but it's not complete control as though they were independent managers or employees who could simply be fired for not complying with what you need to be done. The legal compliance, as Brian had mentioned, is somewhat complicated and is an upfront expense. It requires in-depth disclosures, which sometimes can be somewhat distasteful. It requires disclosures of the personal background of the officers and directors involved in the business. If you've been involved in criminal activity or have a fraudulent, a civil penalty for fraud that you were involved with, those need to be disclosed. If franchise locations have been opened and closed, those need to be disclosed. So there are some costs and levels of uncomfort that you might have with creating and presenting an FDD.
Is there any way to get an idea generally, like a broad ballpark figure of what it would cost to do that initial kickoff to get all the legal documentation and the advice needed? Are we talking 10 grand? I mean, can you give me some ballpark figure or no?
Surely. So there are a variety of ways of doing this. You can go to a local attorney who doesn't have a lot of expertise with franchising, and they will tell you that they can do this for less than $25,000. I would say that that's not rational and that is not realistic. When you're talking about preparing an offering circular, the franchise disclosure document, researching and providing a franchise agreement, analyzing the competition, putting together an operations manual which explains to your franchisees what needs to be done, you're talking about a number which is probably closer to $50,000 to $100,000 for an experienced franchise counsel to do that job. That would include creation of a separate franchise business to protect your, your current business. It would include trademark registrations and it would include a variety of other legal issues that would need to be addressed.
That's really helpful and interesting, and I see why it's important to make sure you cover all your bases.
Right. If you decided to go to an expert, someone who only does franchise law in Washington, D.C. or New York, you should expect to pay between $100,000 and $150,000 at least. So it can get pretty costly if you go to, what people would call the expensive attorneys in the big cities. If you go to a franchise development company, there are companies out there that suggest that they can help you develop a franchise system, help you with sales of the franchise, help you modify your system to make sure that it's replicable, and will help with legal aspects of it. You could be paying in excess of $200,000 to do it. So it really depends, for somebody who's considering franchising, thinking about what they need, what they want to do, how much they want to risk, and defining what their budget might be.
And just initially, I'm assuming, just like with any other legal service, they can go and sort of get a general assessment whether they're even, have good potential. One would assume there could be a consultation type thing.
Right. So certainly, we would provide initial consultations for free. We typically meet people for an hour or a little bit longer to talk about what their system is and sort of explain to them individually what they need to be doing to take it from step 1 to step 2, and what they need to be thinking about, and whether or not franchising makes sense for them. And we're going to cover a little bit of that in the upcoming slides here, but it makes sense for people to sit down with a franchise attorney. It makes sense for them maybe to sit down off the clock with a franchise development company. It makes sense for them to participate in webinars and learn exactly what the advantages and risks are and how they sort of fit into the process and whether they fit into the process. So this webinar would be sort of an initial step. Calling and arranging an initial consultation would be the second step. And then, taking it from there as to, after you have a better idea as to where you want to go and what your budget might be. So again, that's a very, very good question. Let me just go back to the last slide real quick. So, the other disadvantages, again, and this may not be a disadvantage, and I may be repeating myself, is that you do have to understand that you are going from running, again, the ice cream shop or the hamburger joint or the education center or the et cetera, whatever business you're in, to being in the business of franchising. And some people make that transition very well, and others don't make that transition very well. And you really have to consider whether you have the expertise to do that or whether you have to bring someone in who has the expertise to do it. So let's go to the next slide. Just going to take a quick look at the time here and make sure. Okay. So the next question we want to answer is, when should I make the jump? And there are conflicting factors here. Obviously, the earlier you decide to franchise your business, the more you might be a first to market, and there may be less competition available. So that would be a significant advantage to jumping into franchising early. But it's also harder to sell franchises without a track record or with only limited success. And if you don't have multiple locations, you can't really know whether or not your business is replicable. So you might have a lower chance of success with franchising. If you wait a little while longer, you have the advantage of having a better, more proven system. a higher probability of success in replicating that system. And because of your track record in being successful, you might have an easier time in selling your system. On the other hand, people may have already moved in to copy you, and there may be more competition in the marketplace for you to face.
One thing I'd mention is if you do franchise your business early, maybe you only have 1 or 2 locations, and you find that your system needs refinement, it can be refined. You can continue to improve your system of doing business, but you're going to want to hope that you have franchisees that are understanding of that and that are willing to kind of roll with it for the betterment of the overall business, because that might mean changing menu items on them, or changing suppliers, or changing processes. So whether the continuing refinement of the system is a hurdle to you might depend a lot on how willing your franchisees are to go along with those changes.
So we're going to plan to speak for about another 5 minutes, just as a warning, and then if people want to submit questions for us to answer, this is your time to get some free legal advice. You can certainly get that by calling and coming in and meeting with us, but it's your chance to get some free upfront legal advice by submitting questions. There have been several questions which are around what the first steps are. So I just want to take a step back and go a little bit off the slides here and talk about the first steps that you should be taking if you're considering a franchise. So first of all, and I mentioned this already, you really do need to find a qualified franchise attorney. You can't just go to a business attorney or a real estate attorney or anyone else. You need someone who has a history of doing franchising. So, I started in the franchise realm in the 1990s, have been involved in, from a franchisor perspective, a dozen successful and probably a dozen unsuccessful franchises during the course of that time. And we've dealt with a number of franchisees, probably too many to even count. You want somebody with that kind of experience, or even somebody with maybe even more experience if you want to pay, again, somebody who's a franchise attorney exclusively, from the big city. You want to think about early on in the process trademark protection. Have you screened your mark so that you know that it's available throughout the United States or throughout the geographic region in which you want to offer franchises? And have you proceeded to file a trademark registration to protect that mark? If you don't have a trademark, and if you don't have a trademark registration, it is going to be very difficult for you to market your franchise system under that trademark going forward. You may take 2 steps forward only to take 1 step backwards, and you don't want to be in that position. So again, talk to an attorney like Brian or like myself who knows about trademarks, and you can get that trademark protected for you. I would say even if you're not considering franchising in the near future, even just to protect your existing business. You want to think about documenting your system now, every single aspect of your system. What makes your system successful? What distinguishes it from what other people are doing in the marketplace? Why are people going to want to buy your system versus another system? You want to think about it, start documenting it at this point, so that you don't have to start from scratch down the road when you actually get involved in franchising. If you're taking the next step and deciding that you are going to franchise, you need to start documenting your history. You need to start talking to the other people who are involved in your business, your other officers who are going to be involved in the business, about their backgrounds and whether there's anything in their backgrounds that would make them someone you don't want to talk about in your FDD document. You want to study the competition. What is your competition doing right that you can take from them? And what is your competition doing wrong that you don't want to do? What is your niche in the marketplace? What's going to make you successful? What's going to distinguish you from everyone else? And then lastly, again, if you're going down the road of franchising and you know you're going to make the jump, do you want to start to consider hiring staff who may have some expertise in franchising or some skills that may help you franchise your business or run the franchise business, as opposed to hiring folks who can flip the burgers or clean the floors or teach the students, etc. So those are all very, very important first steps that you are going to have to do along the way. So let's turn a little bit now and talk about alternatives to franchising. Before we get into that, everyone comes to us and wants to franchise, and they think they absolutely positively want to franchise. We try to determine whether or not there are less costly alternatives to franchising that may get you to the same place because of the upfront expenses in complying with the various laws. Brian mentioned that when you have a franchise, that there are three aspects to the definition of a franchise. That is the trademark, the fee, and the system of operation. Brian also mentioned that there are federal and state laws to comply with. Each of those state laws and the federal law have different definitions of actually what a franchise is. So while we simplified for purposes of this program what a franchise is, the definition is really very, very broad and varies from state to state. So when we're talking about alternatives to franchising, we have to probably avoid a much broader array of things than what we may have explained to you early on in this program. Did you want to talk more about this, Larry?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that you'll see folks do, and this might even be as a precursor to franchising, something to help define and improve the system, help build up brand recognition in the trademark. You might build some of your own stores. So most franchisors that we work with have at least a few successful company-owned stores that they've operated for a period of time. So if you do not want to expand rapidly and broadly, or if you feel that you need to refine your system and build brand recognition, you might build a couple of your own company-owned stores. If you don't have a particularly refined system for doing business, but you have a powerful brand, you might look at licensing. So there you're licensing a trademark to a potential licensee, but you're not really dictating the day-to-day operations of their business. That might work in a situation where it's all about the product and not so much about the system of doing business and the experience of the customer at the retail store. You might sell the product through mainstream retail channels. So again, if there's no real system behind doing this business, if it's about developing a product and selling it under a brand, instead of developing your own stores and going through that capital expense, you might partner with retailers to get your product on the market. In other situations, you may charge only for the service. We've worked with some businesses who are not really interested in developing franchises or seeking ongoing royalties, but what they do is they help a business get up and running. They provide you with, or they provide the potential buyer with knowledge on how to lay out a certain kind of retail store, how to lay out a coffee shop, where to source the products, what works and what doesn't. But then once the business is up and running, they step away and they don't exercise any more control over the business and they don't dictate the brand. It's more of a coaching or a mentorship that you're offering to a potential buyer, not a long-term sort of partnership that the franchise business is.
We've been involved in several where construction services were provided to build out the locations that the prospective franchisee, or in this case other business person, wanted to operate, but they wouldn't license the trademark and they wouldn't charge a fee for the licensing of the trademark. They just charge for the build out.
So what you have to do, and Mike alluded to some of this, you have to look at what your opportunity is. Does it involve a powerful brand? Does it involve an attractive brand? Is there a defined system that the franchisee needs to follow to get there? And if that's the case, franchising might be right for you. If there's other ways that you feel you can get into the market and expand without having to go through the more burdensome requirements of franchising, then you might try those other opportunities first. You have to evaluate your individual business to see where it fits in all the different types of business opportunities that are out there. We can help you do that, and franchise development companies can help you do that as well.
So this is probably a good time to ask if there are any questions. We have about 10 minutes left in the hour, and we're available to answer whatever questions you might have.
I don't see any right now, although we've kept the people who are on throughout. What I'm going to ask is all of them are members and will get follow-up emails from me. And if you'd be kind enough, I'm going to send them, I'm going to record this, put it on our website, nfib.com/PA. I'm going to also, when I send this out to all of those who signed up and some of those who didn't get on who did sign up, your contact information. Just email me back with any specific questions if you like, or directly to Brian, Greg, and Mike Doctorow, and I will forward you that information. Anyway, thank you all so very much, and thank both of you. Excellent information, and I look forward to posting it and putting it in our newsletter so many more small businesses can partake of all this information. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Have a great day, and we'll be having another webinar in August. That's our next one with the NFIB Legal Center dealing with lawsuits. Look for the email on that. The date is August the 15th. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.